The American Caesar, the Emperor of America, Douglas MacArthur, a brilliant, proud general who never compromised. The man who lost the Philippines to the Japanese, then returned 2 years later, fulfilling his own vow, "I shall return." He became a symbol of American pride, yet also one of the most controversial figures in U.S. military history. From the beaches of Leyte to the battlefields of Korea, he fought not only for victory, but for the honor of his own name. In the early 1942s, the world was engulfed in the storm of war. In Europe, Nazi Germany swept through Poland, occupied Paris, and bombed London. In the Asia-Pacific, Japan expanded its power through force, seizing Manchuria and China before turning its gaze southward toward the resource-rich lands, oil fields, and vital sea routes of Southeast Asia. At that time, the United States remained outside the conflict, but tensions between Washington and Tokyo were rapidly escalating. America imposed an oil embargo, forcing Japan to choose between retreat or attack. In the early hours of the 7th of December, 1941, Japan delivered its answer at Pearl Harbor, a surprise assault that killed more than 2,400 Americans and propelled the United States into World War II. Just 1 day later, Japanese bombs thundered across the Philippines, America's strategic outpost in Southeast Asia. Japanese forces launched a series of landings, striking directly at the U.S. Philippine defensive lines. On the island of Luzon, the supreme commander of U.S. forces in the Far East was struggling to organize the resistance. His name was Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur was born on the 26th of January, 1880, in Little Rock, Arkansas, into a family with a long military tradition. His father, General Arthur MacArthur Jr., was a hero of the American Civil War and later served in the Philippines. Raised in a military environment, Douglas followed in his father's footsteps and attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he graduated first in his class in 1903 with outstanding distinction. Douglas MacArthur was one of the most famous American generals of the 20th century, having fought in all three major conflicts: World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. From a young age, he stood out for his discipline, confidence, and leadership abilities, quickly earning a strong reputation within the U.S. Army. During World War I, he rose to the rank of Brigadier General, receiving 2 Distinguished Service Crosses and 7 Silver Stars for bravery. In the years between the 2 World Wars, MacArthur served as Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army 1000, 935, before being assigned to the Philippines as the Chief Military Advisor, where he helped build the country's defensive forces. When the Pacific War broke out at the end of 1941, Douglas MacArthur was in command of all defensive forces in the Philippines, a strategic outpost guarding Japan's southern advance into Southeast Asia. On the morning of the 8th of December, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the skies over Luzon lit up with flames and thick black smoke. Japanese aircraft launched a surprise raid on Clark Field, the centerpiece of U.S. air power in the Philippines. Dozens of American planes, still lined up on the runway, were destroyed within minutes. Having lost air superiority, MacArthur could only watch helplessly as wave after wave of enemy bombers pounded his positions. In the following days, Japanese forces began a series of massive landings on Luzon, striking from the north at Lingayen Gulf and simultaneously from the south at Lamon Bay, trapping U.S. Philippine troops in a deadly pincer movement. At first, MacArthur attempted to hold the entire island, but the plan quickly collapsed. His troops were under strength, short of supplies, and without naval or air support, while the Japanese advanced relentlessly under heavy cover. By late December, the situation had become desperate. To spare Manila from destruction, MacArthur declared it an open city, withdrawing his main forces to the Bataan Peninsula in accordance with a pre-war defensive plan. There, he resolved to make a final stand, hoping to hold out long enough for reinforcements from America. Meanwhile, his headquarters was relocated to the island fortress of Corregidor, in the middle of Manila Bay. Within the bomb-shaken tunnels of Malinta, amid the acrid smell of gunpowder and the constant thunder of artillery, MacArthur and his staff established a makeshift command post. Day and night, he directed the embattled forces on Bataan, coordinating their desperate defense against the unrelenting assaults of the Japanese army. Day after day, the Japanese tightened their grip around Bataan. Ammunition was running out, food supplies were gone, and the exhausted soldiers still held their ground in the dark tunnels of Corregidor. They fought, knowing there was no way out. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, realizing that the capture of MacArthur would shatter America's morale, issued a top-secret order. MacArthur must leave the Philippines. It was not a retreat, it was an order to preserve hope for a counterattack. On the night of the 11th of March, 1942, under pouring rain and the cover of darkness, MacArthur, along with his wife, child, and a few close officers, quietly boarded a small boat. No lights, no sound. The vessel slipped away from Corregidor, threading through enemy-controlled waters, slowly cutting across the waves toward the south, toward Australia. After several perilous days navigating deadly seas, they finally reached land safely at the small Tarrawee railway station in southern Australia on the morning of the 20th of March, 1942. MacArthur stepped off the train. His face was worn and darkened by sleepless nights, but his eyes remained unyielding. Before the waiting reporters, he spoke slowly and clearly, each word deliberate. "I came through, and I shall return." Washington had advised him to say, "We shall return," but MacArthur refused. To him, this was more than a promise. It was a vow of honor, a personal commitment etched into history. That simple declaration spread quickly across America, becoming a legend, igniting faith and hope among American troops and the Filipino people during the darkest days of the war. In the Philippines, after MacArthur's departure, the garrisons under Generals Jonathan Wainwright and Edward King continued to resist until April 1942. However, exhausted in both manpower and supplies, more than 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers on the Bataan Peninsula were finally forced to surrender on the 9th of April 1942. What followed was the infamous Bataan Death March. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced by the Japanese to march over 100 kilometers under brutal conditions. Thousands perished along the way from starvation, dehydration, exhaustion, or sheer brutality. On the 6th of May 1942, Corregidor Island also fell, and the entire Philippines came under Japanese control. News of the defeat and the horrific suffering of the prisoners shocked the American public, fueling an even stronger determination to see Douglas MacArthur fulfill his vow. "I shall return." Upon arriving in Australia, Douglas MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area. In April 1942, he immediately set to work rebuilding his forces and formulating a plan to counterattack Japan. In his new role, MacArthur coordinated the combined operations of American, Australian, and Allied troops across the New Guinea and Solomon Islands fronts. Although resources were initially limited since most aid was directed toward the European theater, he launched a series of bold counteroffensives. By the end of 1942, Allied forces began their campaign in Papua New Guinea, driving the Japanese out of their strongholds at Bunagona, after months of brutal fighting that lasted until January 1943. This marked MacArthur's first major victory in the Pacific War. Throughout 1943, 1944, he continued to command alongside Chester Nimitz as the Allied forces neutralized Rabaul and isolated numerous Japanese garrisons on surrounding islands without direct combat, a testament to MacArthur's sharp strategic genius. MacArthur's strategy was clear: bypass heavily fortified Japanese bases, such as the main stronghold at Rabaul, rather than waste lives in frontal assaults. Through close coordination with the Central Pacific Command under Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Allies successfully neutralized Rabaul and isolated numerous Japanese garrisons across the Pacific without the need for direct engagement. These achievements showcased MacArthur's strategic brilliance and helped turn the tide of the Pacific War decisively in favor of the Allies. By mid-1944, the balance of power in the Pacific War had completely shifted in favor of the Allies. At that moment, Douglas MacArthur was consumed by one overriding goal: to fulfill his promise to return to the Philippines. Within Allied High Command, some argued that the Philippines should be bypassed in favor of direct assaults on Taiwan or the Chinese coast, but MacArthur stood firmly against this plan. He contended that liberating the Philippines was not only a matter of military strategy, but also of national honor. The United States, he insisted, had a moral obligation to free the Filipino people from Japan's brutal occupation. Strategically, the archipelago was the key link in Japan's southern defensive chain, and retaking it would sever vital enemy supply routes. Ultimately, MacArthur's reasoning prevailed. He convinced President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs of Staff to approve his plan to reconquer the Philippines, setting the stage for one of the most iconic military campaigns of World War II. The campaign began with U.S. forces seizing forward bases at Morotai, now part of Indonesia, in September 1944, before advancing toward Leyte Island in the central Philippines on the 20th of October 1944. On that historic day, General Douglas MacArthur, dressed in khaki, wearing sunglasses, and holding his signature corncob pipe, waded ashore at Red Beach, Leyte, alongside exiled Philippine President Sergio Osmeña. In front of cameras and thousands of soldiers, he solemnly declared, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The image of the American general keeping his word and personally leading the liberation of the Filipino homeland ignited national pride and fierce fighting spirit among both the Filipino people and the Allied forces. However, the road back to the Philippines was anything but easy. The moment American troops set foot on the shores of Leyte, they realized this would not be a simple landing. Torrential rain, thick mud, and concealed Japanese artillery made every advance costly in blood. The Japanese, fully aware of the island's vital strategic importance, were determined to fight to the last man. Just days after the initial landings, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched its remaining fleet in a desperate counterattack. What followed was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, 4 days and nights of relentless combat from October 23 to 26, 1944, the largest and bloodiest naval battle of World War II. American naval forces were split apart. Escort carriers fought alone against overwhelming odds. Ships were sunk, and hundreds of sailors perished. In the skies, Japan unleashed its first kamikaze squadrons, pilots who crashed their planes directly into American vessels, turning the heavens into a sea of fire. Every hour, Leyte became a living hell, burning oil covering the waves, the sky choked with black smoke, and cries for help echoing over the raging sea. Yet through the chaos, the combined efforts of Admirals William Halsey and Thomas Kinkaid brought victory. The Japanese fleet was crushed, losing nearly all its remaining strength in the Pacific. Under MacArthur's command, U.S. and Filipino resistance forces expanded the Leyte beachhead, pushing deeper through jungles, hills, and villages in weeks of brutal fighting. Thousands of American soldiers fell, but by the end of 1944, most of Leyte was liberated. The Battle of Leyte was more than a military triumph. It was the fulfillment of a promise made in 1942. It marked the moment when Douglas MacArthur kept his word and opened the path to the complete liberation of the Philippines. His name now stood at its zenith, celebrated by Americans as the man who brought America back to Asia. After the victory at Leyte, Douglas MacArthur did not stop. He knew that until he had reclaimed Luzon, the largest and most important island of the Philippines, his vow, "I shall return," would remain unfulfilled. In January 1945, under his command, the Allies launched the campaign to retake Luzon. On January 9, hundreds of warships and landing craft poured into Lingayen Gulf, marking the beginning of the largest American amphibious assault in the entire Pacific theater. But the road to Manila was anything but easy. The Japanese had prepared a complex web of defenses hidden deep within jungles, mountains, and underground tunnels. Every valley, every pass, every village became a fortress. Artillery and machine guns lined the American advance, and each step forward came at a heavy cost in blood. The Battle of Manila, fought from February to March 1945, turned into one of the most brutal urban battles of World War II. The city was transformed into a battlefield. Every block, every building became a contested stronghold. Japanese troops fought to the bitter end, detonating explosives, setting fires, and destroying everything in their path. Tens of thousands of civilians perished in the inferno. When MacArthur finally entered Manila, the once beautiful capital lay in ruins, reduced to ashes and rubble, but the American flag once again flew over the government building. By early March 1945, Manila was liberated, ending nearly 3 years of Japanese occupation. MacArthur pressed on, leading further campaigns to free southern Philippines, including Palawan, Cebu, and Mindanao, and coordinating with Australian forces to seize Borneo in the summer of 1945. By July 1945, the entire Philippine archipelago was back under Allied control. On the very soil he had left behind in sorrow 3 years earlier, Douglas MacArthur returned as a victor. His vow, "I shall return," had been fulfilled, not only through force of arms, but through the enduring honor and resolve of an entire nation.
I see that the old flagstaff still stands. Have your troops hoist the colors to its peak, and let no enemy ever haul them down.
With those stunning victories, Douglas MacArthur's reputation in the United States soared to its greatest height. In December 1944, he was promoted to the rank of General of the Army, 5 stars, becoming one of only 5 officers in American history ever to achieve this distinction. In his new position, he took command of the entire U.S. Army in the Pacific and helped draft preliminary plans for the invasion of Japan, scheduled for late 1945. However, that operation never had to be carried out. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought Japan to its knees, forcing an unconditional surrender and ending World War II just before MacArthur would have led what might have been the bloodiest campaign of the entire war. On the 2nd of September 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, General Douglas MacArthur, representing the Allied powers, presided over the formal ceremony of Japan's unconditional surrender. In a gesture rich with symbolism, he invited General Jonathan Wainwright, who had surrendered at Corregidor, and General Arthur Percival, who had surrendered at Singapore, to stand behind him and witness the moment, marking both revenge fulfilled and the closing of the war's darkest chapter. In his solemn address to representatives of the nations present, MacArthur called upon humanity to build a new peace, declaring,
I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
Those words were not mere rhetoric. They heralded the beginning of his next great mission, the reconstruction and democratization of Japan, a task that would reshape not only that nation, but the entire future of post-war Asia. After World War II, Douglas MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, overseeing the occupation of Japan. From 1945 to 1951, he effectively became the country's ruler-wielding authority, greater even than that of Emperor Hirohito. With this immense power, MacArthur launched a sweeping series of reforms that transformed Japan from a militarist empire into a modern democratic nation. He ordered the disbandment of Japan's armed forces and war institutions, enforcing complete demilitarization. At the same time, he oversaw the drafting of a new constitution modeled on Western democracy, granting the Japanese people freedoms they had never experienced before: gender equality, freedom of speech, and universal suffrage among them. In parallel, MacArthur drove major economic and social reforms. He implemented land redistribution to empower farmers, restructured the education system, encouraged labor unions, and dismantled the powerful wartime industrial conglomerates known as zaibatsu. These measures not only rebuilt Japan, but also laid the foundation for its post-war prosperity and democratic stability. Under MacArthur's supervision, Japan transformed with remarkable speed from a defeated empire into a peaceful, democratic, and forward-looking nation. His influence was so profound that he became the only foreigner ever included in the list of the 12 architects of modern Japan. At the time, the Japanese people regarded him with a unique mix of reverence and awe, affectionately referring to him as the Shogun or the retired Emperor Taishogun, a symbolic acknowledgement that MacArthur, not the emperor, was the true ruler of Japan during the nation's post-war rebirth. While carrying out his mission in Japan, Douglas MacArthur continued to be revered in the United States as a national hero. Many called for him to enter politics, and conservative groups within the Republican Party sought to nominate him as a presidential candidate in 1944, 1948, and 952, though none of these efforts succeeded. Although MacArthur occasionally expressed interest in serving his country in a political capacity, he ultimately chose not to pursue elected office. Instead, he remained devoted to his military career until history summoned him once again in 1950, when the Korean War erupted, setting the stage for the final and most controversial chapter of his life. In June 1950, the Korean War erupted and North Korean Communist forces crossed the 38th parallel, launching a massive invasion of South Korea. At that time, Douglas MacArthur was 70 years old and commanding U.S. forces in Japan. But President Harry S. Truman immediately appointed him commander of the United Nations forces in Korea. Under his leadership was a diverse coalition, troops from the United States, South Korea, and several other allied nations. The first months of the war were disastrous. North Korean forces advanced with overwhelming speed, pushing South Korean and American troops steadily southward until they were trapped in a narrow defensive pocket around the Pusan perimeter in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. The situation grew so dire that it seemed South Korea might fall entirely, yet MacArthur remained calm and resolute. While reinforcing Pusan's defenses throughout August 1950, he was secretly planning a bold and audacious counterstrike, one that would change the course of the entire war. On the 15th of September 1950, Douglas MacArthur executed the most daring maneuver of his entire military career. While most United Nations forces were trapped in a small defensive pocket around the Pusan perimeter at the southern tip of the Korean peninsula, he decided to strike deep behind enemy lines, launching an amphibious landing at the port of Incheon, just a few dozen kilometers from Seoul. The plan was considered insane by many. Incheon's geography was treacherous. Its narrow harbor, shifting tides that rose and fell more than 8 meters a day, and mudflats that could track down fleets, made the operation extremely risky. A single miscalculation of time could have stranded every night, leaving the entire force exposed to enemy artillery. But MacArthur trusted his maps, his experience, and his instincts. As he famously said, "The very reason they think we won't do it is why we must do it." At dawn that day, under a thick blanket of fog, hundreds of UN warships unleashed a massive bombardment on the coastal defenses. The thunder of naval guns rolled across Incheon Bay, the opening salvo of one of the boldest amphibious assaults in modern military history. Amid the shell fire, waves of U.S. Marines and South Korean troops advanced in landing craft toward the beaches. Within hours, the key landing zones Blue Beach and Red Beach were secured. The North Koreans were completely taken by surprise. Concentrating almost all their forces at the Pusan front, they had never imagined an attack from the rear. The small garrison at Incheon was wiped out within a single day. Without pause, MacArthur ordered an immediate advance toward Seoul. Through shattered streets and burning buildings, UN Marines and infantry fought block by block, bridge by bridge. On the 28th of September, 1950, barely 2 weeks after the operation began, Seoul was liberated. The Battle of Incheon was not just a tactical success, it was one of the most brilliant turnarounds in modern warfare. From near defeat at Pusan, UN forces had seized the initiative and launched a full-scale counteroffensive. The enemy's rear was cut off, tens of thousands of North Korean troops fell into disarray, and the momentum of the entire war shifted overnight. Incheon saved South Korea, and once again, Douglas MacArthur's name echoed around the world as the general who feared neither risk nor failure, and who always chose the path no one else dared to take. The Incheon victory was hailed as a masterpiece of modern military strategy, catapulting Douglas MacArthur's prestige to its zenith. Western newspapers celebrated him as the savior of South Korea, while military analysts called it one of the most successful amphibious operations in history. The war's momentum shifted completely. What had begun as a desperate defensive struggle turned into an overwhelming offensive. By October 1950, United Nations forces had crossed the 38th parallel and were advancing deep into North Korean territory. Driven by his ambition to unify the entire Korean peninsula by force, MacArthur pressed onward. His troops captured Pyongyang, then Hamhung, pushing relentlessly northward. By late November 1950, the UN armies stood at the banks of the Yalu River, the border with China, and it seemed that final victory was only a matter of time. However, MacArthur's success was short-lived. In late November 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteer troops suddenly crossed the Yalu River, launching massive surprise attacks against the widely dispersed United Nations forces spread across North Korea. Caught off guard and facing brutal winter conditions, UN troops found themselves in a perilous situation. Many units were forced to fight their way out while retreating through frozen mountains and forests. Chaos swept the front lines as temperatures plunged far below freezing. By early December 1950, the Allied forces had no choice but to abandon Pyongyang and fall back southward. By January 1951, combined Chinese and North Korean forces had retaken Seoul, driving the front once more below the 38th parallel. The brilliant victories that had once defined MacArthur's campaign were suddenly overshadowed by this disastrous retreat from the Yalu River, delivering a devastating blow to his prestige and marking the beginning of the most turbulent phase of his career. Even in the face of disaster, Douglas MacArthur refused to accept defeat. As icy winds swept across the Han River, he immediately began reorganizing his battered forces. Units that had suffered heavy losses were withdrawn, reinforced, and re-equipped. New defensive lines were established along the Suwon-Wonju-Daejeon axis, forming a protective corridor south of Seoul. While Chinese and North Korean troops still held the advantage, MacArthur ordered a bold shift from defense to counteroffensive. In February 1951, the United Nations counterattack began. Artillery thundered to clear the way, while tanks and infantry pushed forward across snow-covered terrain. Fierce battles erupted at Chipyeongni, Wonju, and Hoengsong, where U.S., British, and South Korean troops withstood wave after wave of assaults from vastly superior Chinese forces. The Battle of Chipyeongni became a symbol of endurance and resolve. Barely 5,000 American and French soldiers, surrounded by over 20,000 enemy troops, held their ground for days until reinforcements broke through the siege. The victory marked a turning point in morale, proving that UN forces could stand firm against the Chinese onslaught. From there, MacArthur expanded his offensive. By March 1951, UN troops advanced northward once more, liberating Seoul for the second time. The city lay in ruins, reduced to ashes after changing hands multiple times, but the blue flag of the United Nations once again flew above the government building. By early April 1951, the front lines had stabilized around the 38th parallel, back to where the war had begun. Yet from this point onward, the Korean War descended into stalemate. Both sides were exhausted, neither strong enough to deliver a decisive blow. The guns still roared, soldiers still fell, but the battle lines hardly moved. MacArthur understood that he had restored the military balance, but for a man who believed that war held meaning only when it ended in absolute victory, this stalemate was something he could never accept. As the war reached a stalemate, a serious rift developed between Douglas MacArthur and President Harry S. Truman over the war's strategic direction. MacArthur advocated for an all-out expansion of the conflict to achieve complete victory. He proposed bombing Chinese bases in Manchuria, even using tactical nuclear weapons if necessary, and bringing Taiwan, the Republic of China, into a wider alliance to strike against Communist China. To him, anything short of total victory was unacceptable. In contrast, Truman and his advisors feared that widening the war would ignite World War III, drawing in both China and the Soviet Union. The administration in Washington insisted on pursuing a limited war, one designed solely to defend South Korea, not to provoke a global confrontation with the communist bloc. Despite clear directives from the White House, MacArthur repeatedly and publicly expressed his disagreement with government policy. The situation reached its peak when he sent a letter to the Republican leader in the House of Representatives, harshly criticizing Truman's strategy. When the letter was leaked to the public, it caused a political firestorm in Washington and was seen as a direct challenge to presidential authority. To President Truman, this was an act of insubordination of the highest order, an offense unacceptable for any officer in the United States military. And the 11th of April 1951, President Harry S. Truman abruptly relieved General Douglas MacArthur of his command. The announcement shocked not only the United States, but the entire world. MacArthur, the hero who had triumphantly returned to the Philippines, was now dismissed in the midst of the Korean War, in what became one of the most controversial decisions in American history. At first, the American public and many politicians reacted with outrage over the firing of the legendary general. To them, MacArthur was the man who had saved South Korea, while the current stalemate was seen as the result of Washington's weak and cautious policy. Opinion polls at the time showed that a majority of Americans sided with MacArthur, viewing him as a patriot wronged by political restraint. When MacArthur returned to the United States in April 1951, his first time home since 1937, he was greeted as a hero returning to his homeland. The city of New York held a grand ticker-tape parade in his honor, while the U.S. Congress invited him to address a joint session of both houses. On the 19th of April 1951, MacArthur stepped onto the rostrum and delivered his farewell address, one of the most memorable speeches in American history. He solemnly declared that he had acted only according to his conscience and duty as a soldier, and ended with the immortal words, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." That deeply poetic line forever etched MacArthur's image into history as a towering military figure who had fulfilled his mission, even as he was cast aside by the very government he had served. In his final years, Douglas MacArthur gradually withdrew into a quiet, private life. In 1952, he accepted a ceremonial civilian position as chairman of the board of Remington Rand. Though he occasionally appeared in public, always greeted with warmth and admiration, he no longer held any significant political or military role. Despite repeated calls and campaigns from supporters urging him to run for president, MacArthur never formally entered the race. Instead, he devoted his time to writing his memoirs, reflecting on his long military career, and offering advice to select political leaders. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy invited him to serve as an informal advisor on Asian strategy. During their meeting, MacArthur reportedly warned Kennedy against becoming entangled in a land war in Asia, a piece of counsel that would echo hauntingly in the years to come as America deepened its involvement in the Vietnam War. Douglas MacArthur passed away on the 5th of April, 1964, in Washington, D.C., at the age of 84. His funeral was held with full state honors, and his remains were laid to rest in Norfolk, Virginia, the hometown of his wife. He is remembered as a brilliant yet complex general, a visionary strategist, fearless commander, and devoted patriot who altered the course of war in both the Pacific and Korean theaters through bold, decisive leadership. MacArthur's legacy is inseparable from his triumphant campaigns against Japan, particularly the liberation of the Philippines, where he fulfilled his legendary promise, "I shall return." The legacy of Douglas MacArthur, from his brilliant military triumphs to his far-reaching post-war political vision, remains deeply etched in the memory of history. His name endures as a legend, both radiant and turbulent, embodying an era of great commanders who helped shape the world order that emerged in the aftermath of World War II.